Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here and good evening. Tonight we're joined by Anne Paulson and Jeremy Levine, who are just two stellar watchdogs in the Bay Area as we're gearing up in the Monterey Bay Area for housing elements season. Just going to talk through, as the title says, using housing elements to get good housing policy. Next slide, Jeremy. And then for this one, I'll just start off with introductions here, if that's okay. So with us today, we have Jeremy Levine, who's the policy manager with the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County, and also the executive director of Inclusive Lafayette, as well as the legislative director for Contra Costa Young Dems. First started in housing as a volunteer with Inclusive Lafayette in June of 2020, and then went on with the Housing Leadership Council and has really done the astonishing feat of reviewing every housing element in San Mateo County, 19 for anyone keeping track, plus a few in Contra Costa County. Jeremy lives in Oakland, but as said before, still very active in Inclusive Lafayette and Peninsula for Everyone. And tonight he's here in his volunteer capacity as a YIMBY watchdog, and really to partner with cities who want to help plan for more homes and, of course, to meet their legal requirements. We also have Anne Paulson, who lives in Palo Alto, but really got her start.
I live in Los Altos.
Oh, in Los Altos. Sorry.
It's the difference.
Yeah, but got her start in housing element advocacy by submitting public comments in Southern California, and sent HCD comments for 5 or 6 Southern California jurisdictions, and was also instrumental in Orange County's People for Housing advocacy by reading and analyzing several of their housing elements so they could submit public comments. And particularly proud of exposing Canyon Lake's nefarious antics, especially since she was the only public commenter on that housing element. Before the housing element process began in the Bay Area, Anne analyzed housing production in her own backyard of Los Altos and produced a spreadsheet of every single commercial property in that city to be ready for what the city was to put in their housing element. Anne is also a member of the steering committee of the Los Altos Affordable Housing Alliance, and she's formed and led a subgroup of housing element watchdogs for the Los Altos process. Anne's hopeful that Los Altos' latest housing element draft will be approved by HCD. Last but not least, Anne continues to send comments to HCD about issues with housing elements, having sent a comment on Woodside's latest draft last weekend. That's quite a lot to go through. Jeremy, did you want to take it away here? And Anne?
Happy to take it away from here. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the lovely introductions. We're not just here to listen to me and Anne talk because we're pretty faces who sound good, though that may be true. We are here because we want to build more housing. And it is pretty hard to make cities plan for more housing. But conveniently, California law has this tool called housing elements that requires cities to plan for housing. So we're here because we want to leverage housing elements and encourage the cities that we live in and work in to build more housing. Before I get into the thick of it, I want to be clear, we are on a legal frontier. Many of the housing element laws are new. This is the first time they have been in effect. We don't totally know how they are going to be, how they are going to play out. Anne and I are going to outline a sort of housing element playbook, like different strategies that you can use that we have made up and arranged for this presentation, but the playbook doesn't exist. We are making it up. We did not have one for what we did. We had the kind of pieces and fragments people had pulled together, but again, this is all new. And what you are going to get is the freshest housing element information out there. So fresh that some of it's probably provisional. Things we tell you might change. We're in the middle of legislative history, so the way the laws are enforced and interpreted is evolving. And so we're so excited to have you be a part of that. You are going to learn, as part of this process, the legal tools at your disposal, and what the laws are, kind of how you can figure out what's actually useful versus what might just be distracting. We're going to talk about how this process can be used to bring in other groups and build power that allows you to actually get the political support you need as part of this planning process. Again, this is, I say it's a planning process, but it's very political. So we're going to talk about lobbying the different political entities that are part of this planning process. And we're going to talk about throughout this process, which is long and arduous, what different strategies are to engage. We have this agenda. We just did the lovely welcome and speaker intros. I'm going to talk about what a housing element is for a few minutes. Anne and me a little bit are going to dig into how you can actually use housing elements. We're going to give you some tales from our experiences with housing elements. You'll get a chance to ask questions, and then we can all go eat dinner, hopefully. Or maybe some of you are eating dinner now, and that's wonderful for you. So what is a housing element? Definitely not a slide I forgot to make. But you can close your eyes and just imagine, because I can paint the picture for you. Housing elements are long legal documents. They are 500 to 1500 pages filled with data and analysis and tables. Underneath all of the jargon and information and misery that there may appear to be on the surface of the housing element, there is a story about the housing in a community and what is happening now with that housing, how it's affecting people, and what can be done to change it. Specifically, there are a set of analyses. The bedrock of a housing element is these analyses: an analysis of housing need, an analysis of constraints, and an analysis of fair housing. And these three analyses are supposed to look at, again, what the housing needs of the community are, who needs housing, what they're paying, how many people, just a ton of information about what the housing need is. The constraints, what are the legal governmental constraints preventing that housing from getting built? And then a fair housing analysis called affirmatively furthering fair housing that considers things like segregation and integration and equity and looks at mapping and a bunch of factors that relate to how the city tangibly plans for housing in a way that makes it possible for new people to be a part of the community. These analyses then translate to a site inventory, a set of sites where the city says these are the locations where housing can be built to meet the needs, to promote fair housing in our community that we uncovered after doing all of these great analyses. And then finally, cities have a set of policies and programs by which they remove the constraints and provide new incentives for building housing on those sites, and in other ways promoting fair housing, like tenant protections and things that ensure that the development that occurs happens equitably. So this is the story of a housing element: analyses and sites translating to real policy change. It's all about the policy change. That is where the money is. That is why we go through this whole process, because we can get cities to commit to tangibly change their laws over the next 8 years. And then I should say, housing elements don't just get made in a vacuum. Cities put together these plans, and then they submit them to the State Department of Housing and Community Development for review. And the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, then takes those housing elements, reviews them, gives the city's feedback, and they work on it until HCD certifies it. We're going to talk about that whole timeline in a little bit. But I want to talk about the history of housing elements, a slide I certainly also did not forget to make, because the history is just so vivid, I can lay that also. This is a process that's been around since the end of the 60s. So it's an old process. Cities have been doing housing elements for a while, and it has been a really important planning process. Almost every affordable housing development in the Bay Area has its roots in a housing element. When a city decided they wanted to take this planning process seriously and start putting the resources together to get affordable housing built. Emphasis on when a city decided to get affordable housing built, because it was really a voluntary process, and most cities ignored the process. And even when they did try to do something with it, almost none of them ever did enough. And HCD, which was still reviewing the housing elements at that time, I mean, i.e. the past 60 years before 2017, really was open to letting cities get away with things they didn't have a lot of enforcement powers to do otherwise. So HCD would get these bad housing plans from cities and rubber stamp them, and the status quo would continue. However, in 2017, a slate of new laws, and since 2017, I should say, a slate of new laws have changed the rules of the game so that housing elements have gone from being a useful but purely voluntary planning tool to a contract with the state, where cities make binding commitments that have to actually address the issues that they're seeing. And part of that deal is that HCD, the regulator, has much stronger enforcement powers to tell cities what their plans are doing is not good enough, and that cities need to go back to the drawing boards. The thing is that HCD, though they've gotten a lot more resources in recent years, still does not have enough resources or good information to hold cities accountable to following all of the rules on their own, which is where we come in, helping fill the gaps and giving HCD the information that they need to enforce the law to the fullest extent of their abilities. Whoops, went through that. There is a due date for HCD to have certified these housing elements in your area, the Santa Cruz Monterey area. That due date is December 15th, 2023. By my understanding, it was January 31st, 2023 in the Bay Area. It was October 15th, 2022 in SCAG. The regions are moving on different timelines, but this is your region's timeline. I say that March 15th is sort of the deadline because there's a secondary date at which, if a city has still not received approval from HCD, still not been certified, then a new set of penalties kicks in. And I want to emphasize that part of the change. Well, I'll talk about the penalties in a little bit. I don't want to get ahead of myself. The process is pretty arduous. When I said it's long earlier, I meant really long. This is a timeline. I have a full graphic that actually has more text explaining each step, but I whited it out so that I could explain each step to you instead. So there's the outreach part, which this is how you start a housing element. It takes a while. Most cities are taking 3 to 12 months with the outreach alone, which is why when I say this starting, just this first step can take 5 months theoretically, it never takes 5 months. It always takes much longer than that because you have to do outreach, and the outreach takes a while. Public hearings, mailers, surveys, whatever. Cities do all these kinds of things to get public input, but they have to do something in order to justify that their housing element is legit. So it takes a while. Then cities release a draft of their housing element, and they have a 30-day minimum public comment period. After that, there's a 10-day minimum. Again, it's almost always longer period where cities revise their housing elements in response to public comment. And then cities submit those housing elements. This is the first draft of their housing element to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, which has 90 days to review it. HCD always takes the full 90 days. They don't do it shorter, really. They pretty much always take the full 90 days. And then after those 90 days, the HCD could theoretically certify a city's housing element, and the process ends. It has happened in the Bay Area. Alameda followed approximately that timeline where they did a housing element, they submitted it to HCD, they got the check mark, and that was that. Their process ended. Alameda and Emeryville might be the only ones who that happened to in the Bay Area. Almost every other city has to go through the next step of the process, which is an indeterminate period of review and revision, where each round, when I say, again, 2.5 months minimum, takes 3 to 6 months in practice. Because cities have to take a lot of time to do these revisions, they have to release them for public review for 7 days. And then when they resubmit to HCD for a second round of review, HCD has 60 days. Fewer than 90 days, but it is 60 days each round of review indefinitely into the future. And most jurisdictions are going to take 3 to 5 rounds of review. That's how long it's taken in Southern California. That's how long HCD thinks it's going to take in the Bay Area. That's how long it'll probably take in Santa Cruz. So all your jurisdictions, in many cases, are just starting now, 9 months before, 8 months before the due date. And they have a process that if you add up the first round of like 9 to 18 months, and the second round, which is 3 to 6 months each round of revision, you have cities that are going to be out of compliance for like 6 months to 2 years in most cases. So buckle in, we're in for a ride, I would say. A lot of cities respond to feedback from HCD really seriously, and some cities take the housing element process and the feedback they get and they make big changes. But what we're seeing in most Bay Area cities is that they're in disbelief that they are, one, violating the law, or that the penalties will really apply to them. And so they are being pretty casual in response to what's happening. And the thing is that there are consequences. So if a city is too late, if they don't have their housing element in on time, they can face third-party lawsuits. There have already been more than a dozen lawsuits in the Bay Area and another over a dozen in Southern California, but we're much more organized in Northern California than in SoCal. So like there are a lot more lawsuits coming up here. You've probably heard about the builder's remedy, one of the penalties that means a city without a compliant housing element cannot use their zoning to deny housing approval. So like 10-story buildings in single-family neighborhoods, the city would have to approve it. At least they couldn't use their zoning to deny it, I should say. And as time runs on, the second, if a city doesn't just miss the first deadline, but misses a second deadline 120 days after the first deadline, then they lose access to state grants, and a number of other penalties come in. At a certain point, a city could theoretically be sued and be ordered to pay fines or have a court-ordered rezoning. We're pretty far away from that happening in any city. So it's very theoretical, but what is not theoretical is getting sued and having to settle unfavorably and be forced to make concessions in a housing element and pay some money potentially. And the builder's remedy is just a complete loss of local control. So it's worth noting how the process is playing out because it is evolving with time. Like I said, this is a living process we're in the middle of. So in San Diego, which was a year and a half or 2 years ahead of us, like the Bay Area and Santa Cruz, Monterey, I guess they're even further ahead of Santa Cruz and Monterey. They had a pretty easy time. And in the San Diego area, most cities got approved pretty quickly. But by the time that HCD had reached Southern California, they had become much stricter and were not accepting the exact same things that cities did in San Diego were not getting accepted in Southern California. So HCD just changed their standards and became a little stricter. And in the Bay Area, it looks like they are being even stricter still, in large part because the Bay Area had more early public commenters than in the Southern California area. And so HCD had a lot of information showing that many cities were not doing a very good job, and continues to be really strict, which emphasizes just how valuable some of those comments can be. There have been, like I said, some lawsuits in the Bay Area and SCAG, and right now I forget how many cities, but a lot of them, there are only 8 compliant Bay Area cities. So the process is exciting. I'm a little over time, so I'm going to wrap this up and pass it along to Anne to talk about how you can actually use it.
Okay. Let's see. Am I on mic now? Hello?
You are. We could hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So as Jeremy just explained, we're we want the cities. You want your city to make a good housing element, so you get housing. You have to keep an eye on what the job is, what we're doing. The housing element is for housing, and as he also just explained, it's a long process. And the earlier you start, like now, the more influence you have. So I'm from Los Altos. And with a lot of luck and a lot of hard work by people in our city staff and the city council and us advocates, we ended up with a housing element that we think will give us more housing, and we think will be accepted by HCD. It's adopted, so we're going forward with it. Now, one thing that actually does focus city's attention is the threat of a lawsuit, particularly in Los Altos, because we already have been sued for violating housing law, and it cost us $1 million because we did violate it. So we're going ahead with implementing our housing element, and in a recent city council meeting to implement one of the programs, to stiffen the council's backbone in case they were to think about backsliding, the staff put the text of the whole YIMBY lawsuit against our neighbors in the agenda packet. Now, next slide, please. Okay, now I of course knew about that lawsuit because there's me serving the papers on our neighbors Palo Alto and Cupertino. That's Palo Alto, and that it was a very nice city clerk. Okay, it's fun. That was fun. But our goal is housing, not lawsuits. So let's talk about how to get housing. Next slide, please. And yeah, so there, you're going to start out by figuring out what you're doing, by getting data and finding allies, figuring out what you want, and then advocating. Next slide. So it's this is something I did a lot in Los Altos, and I think it's really useful. You need to understand what is going on now in your city, so you can understand how it needs to change. So how much housing has been built in your city this cycle, which information is available from HCD and probably also available from your city. What kinds of housing is it? Look at multifamily housing, look at ADUs, for example. If your city did a rezoning, and I know that Capitola did, although it might be too late for this, you want to look at what happened, whether it's making any difference. If you upzoned and they said, well, we're going to get more housing now, well, are you? Is it making any difference, or do you need to go higher? And then you want to look at the site inventory from the last housing element, the one we're in now. Because you want to know, last time your city said, we're going to build housing there. Well, did they? So look at every single site and see if it had housing built on it. And this is actually sort of fun, because you're going to see some really humorous stuff probably. So I was looking at Woodside last week, and they're at their 5th cycle housing element. And they had listed Forest View Road. I'm not talking about a parcel on Forest View Road. They listed the road. It was a private road, and apparently they thought a house would be built in the middle of it. I don't know. And then, so that one was removed this cycle. I'm glad to see that they got sane about it. They have a few other sites that are listed as having active landslides. And these sites were on the 5th cycle, and they've put them back on the 6th cycle, active landslides. So I think I know why a site with an active landslide was not built last time. They're saying that all their sites are going to be built this time, including the 5 with active landslides. Anyway, so you're going to look at sites, see what's going on with those sites, see what's wrong with them, see what, for ones you think are plausible, what would make it possible to build on these when they weren't built. You want to look at, I may have already said this, but you want to look at the process for building housing. it's going to be, look at how long it takes from the time the person comes to your city wanting, a multifamily builder comes to your city wanting to build a building till the time that builder has a permit in their hand. How long is that? And what are the steps of that? Because there is where you need to get rid of some of those steps, probably. So look at what's actually happening. See how many hearings there are, see how many approval bodies there are. And there's a place where you want to look to make it, to get rid of those things. You'd love it if you didn't have any hearings and it was ministerially, if you followed the guidelines, you got approved. But at least you want to get rid of some of those steps. The more you get rid of, the better. Next slide, please. And then you want to find go back. You want to find out your allies. Who are your allies that might help you understand what are good ideas to advocate for? So you're in the housing element, you're going to be advocating for programs where the city, as Jeremy explained, commits to doing things to make housing, and for sites. And your allies can help you in certain areas figure out what programs that you didn't think of that are really good programs. So for example, if you go to tenant organizations, they might have ideas about rent control or about tenant opportunity to buy or various excellent ideas that you didn't think of. Farm workers in some of your cities, that's not been very relevant over here in the Bay Area, but you guys have farm workers. And I've been following the news, and the state of farm worker housing is a scandal, right? I mean, it's been a scandal in Half Moon Bay. All those farm workers in down south of you were all flooded. It's your city is required to have programs to deal with farm worker housing. So farm workers are definitely a resource for you. Go to students, you Santa Cruz people. Students are your allies. You can get them to come to the meetings too. And try to work with developers. It can be hard sometimes. Developers sometimes are closed mouthed about some of their financial considerations because it's a trade secret, but they're the ones who know what is making housing impossible to build or difficult to build. And if you can cultivate relationships with both for-profit developers and affordable housing developers, you can find out a lot, and they'll help you understand what needs to happen. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now you've gotten your data and you've talked to people and gotten ideas for programs. Now you're going to figure out what you want. Santa Cruz YIMBY wrote an excellent priorities for housing elements piece. It's really good. It has wonderful ideas. And what you want to do for your city is take those more general ideas and make specific ideas that apply to your city. For example, transit-oriented development is a really good idea. What you're going to do for your city is, okay, you want transit-oriented development. Where? Make a map and say exactly what density you want and what zoning provisions you want in these areas. You're advocating for something specific. You're advocating for no parking minimums and 6 stories or something. Whatever you're advocating for something specific in a specific place. Be specific. And then this is when you're going to be starting to think about writing. You'll be sending letters, and so it's a good idea to start writing these things up. And as you write them up, those of us who've been sending letters, so many letters, find that it really helps when you're sending out letters to people about what you want to get a lot of pairs of, maybe several at least, pairs of eyes on your work. Whenever I write something, and I think it's pretty good, and then I put it out and have some other people look at it, almost inevitably, they make suggestions that are good. They tell me things that are good that need to be changed. And whenever this piece of writing is finished, it's always much better than what I came up with in the beginning. And I've seen that with other people's letters as well. Okay, next slide. And then you're going to advocate. And if you know what you want, you're going to advocate what you want. So I think that Jeremy said, and this must be true, that you have various community meetings now discussing housing elements. There's like community meetings with city staff, and also often you have city council meetings, city council study sessions. This is where you want to show that there are members of your community that want housing. So get everybody to show up, and everybody who's brave enough should make a public comment. So how you make these public comments for this particular thing is you want it to be, because you usually don't have much time, make it short, make it easy to understand. And when you make a comment, only advocate for one thing. I mean, of course, you're going to advocate for more building, more housing. Everyone you work with wants to advocate for that, but you're going to be advocated maybe for some specific thing. And you want to keep it simple. And the other thing is, it's really good to connect a want with a story. So, for example, I'll give you an example of what I sometimes do. I, of course, would say I'm for more housing. And then I say, my son is disabled. He doesn't drive. He's a low-wage worker. And whenever he goes to a meeting, excuse me, whenever he goes to get an apartment, he invariably has to pay for an apartment that is that he has to. Hello, am I still here? Hello?
You're all good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
He has to pay. Good. He has to. My son has to pay for parking. He doesn't drive. Why is he paying for a parking space? He's paying for a parking space because no builder can build an apartment for people that doesn't have parking spaces. We shouldn't have parking minimums. So I connect up what I'm saying, my ask with a story about a real person who suffers from the lack of what I'm asking for. So that's community meetings. When you're talking to city staff are typically pretty knowledgeable. So when you talk to city staff, first of all, you want to be honest, of course. You're going to tell them that you're advocating for housing, that you're watchdogging the housing element, that you will be commenting to the city about this housing element. You will also be commenting to the HCD. But you want them to realize, and you should realize too, that they're on the same page as you. City staffers are the ones who suffer if their city doesn't have a housing element. If the city gets sued, they're the ones who have to prepare the information for the lawsuit. If the city has a builder's remedy project, they're the ones that have to be between the NIMBYs in the city who don't want this project to be built and the law that says they have to build it. They have to handle this project they don't know how to handle because it's not allowed in their community. Also, they typically are young, so they're more likely to have experienced the kind of housing insecurity that everybody experiences when they're young, mostly everybody in this area. So you want them to realize that you're on their side and you have their back when they propose things. So for city staff, this is where you're going to take that list of things that you said you wanted, and you're going to write it up, and you're going to give the whole thing to them, perhaps broken up a little bit. This is where you're getting specific and detailed. You can get into the weeds with city staff. But with city staff, the other thing is that housing elements are a lot of work. They have to come up with the programs and the ideas for this and the ideas for that. And if you give them something already packaged and you explain how it satisfies one of the things that they're required to do, you're helping them. That's a help for them. It's giving them you have their back, and you also, they don't have to do it because you already did. You want to definitely connect it with what they're required to do. So, for example, you might say, well, we should allow SB 10 upzonings in this certain community because some desirable community, because that will affirmatively further fair housing. Explain how this idea that you're proposing is something that will satisfy a goal that they have. And then we have city councils. Now, city councils tend to not understand the process. Well, it's complicated. You can't blame them. They don't. You have to hold their hands. So be simple with city councils. They don't know. And Jeremy talked about something, but you need to make something concrete for city councils, because they typically just do not know this. They see the deadline. It's December 15th. And they think, well, we have tons of time. But they don't realize that, as Jeremy explained, once you have a draft housing element, you have a 30-day public comment period, 10 days to respond, 90 days with HCD, and they take all 90 days. And then to revise it, it has to be a few weeks. So you cannot possibly, if you assume that you're going to have your second draft will be good, which is a pretty strong assumption. But even then, you can't possibly be compliant on time. You cannot possibly make the deadline unless you have a first draft by the middle of July. And they don't understand this. They think they have tons of time. And then it's the infuriating thing, and you've been telling them all this time, they don't have tons of time. They get to the end of the process and they say, well, it was rushed. Well, it was rushed because you didn't start soon enough. It's not, these deadlines are not a secret. Anyway, with city council also focus on the values that you share with them, because they really do want to do the best for their city, even if you don't necessarily agree with what that is. But they also probably want to be on the right side of the law. Most city councils want to be on the right side of the law. It's not a great thing to get a lawsuit. And then there's advocating for with HCD at the end of the process, and I'll turn that over to Jeremy. So here goes Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone. I have to have my own gap. The big thing about talking to HCD is that it's not separate from your conversations with staff or the city. It's really an extension of them. HCD wants to see that you have engaged with the city in good faith. So even if you have the most frustrating of frustrating city staffs and a council that doesn't want to work with you, it's really helpful to send comments, treating them in good faith, telling them what you would want to see in that housing element, because HCD wants to see that you've made the attempt and given them the opportunity to make a good housing plan. So it's not it's bad practice to send things to HCD that you did not send to the city, and HCD will potentially take what you say less seriously. The housing element is a really big document. There are all those analyses I told you about, and then there's all this stuff about the sites. And the fact is that not all parts are weighted equally, and not all parts have equal impact. Based on, this is one of the parts that's really seems to change frequently, or at least our perception of it seems to change frequently. But at least for the past little while, it has seemed that HCD emphasizes sites, fair housing, AFFH, and to some extent the public input process. And to elaborate on those things, if you can demonstrate that a city is using bogus sites, HCD often takes that pretty seriously. Like in Lafayette, the city was claiming that a BART parking lot would turn into housing, and that would be the majority of the city's low-income housing. And it's actually a great place for housing, but it's not on BART's timeline of development until after 2030, well after the sixth cycle. And that's because of things Lafayette has done, and it's not something that can really be changed. So Lafayette submitted a housing element, and they just didn't talk about BART's timeline of development. They completely ignored a relevant constraint to development of housing on this site. So what we did is we sent HCD we sent the city a letter saying, here's the timeline, here's why the site isn't good and why you need to rezone elsewhere to accommodate housing instead in a realistic place. And then we followed up with HCD and said, look, the city's saying this about the site, and here is some other relevant information that you should know that will help you make your decision. And HCD saw that helpful, relevant information, and they rejected Lafayette's housing element, and they told them that they can't use the site because it wasn't going to get built in the planning period. And so that's the kind of emphasis that HCD really enjoys, just a clear, definable reason why that site is not likely to be developed, or just compelling evidence that it would be really difficult. They also care about fair housing, and this is different across jurisdictions. And the way that it gets enforced, the way that AFFH gets enforced, varies based on reviewer to reviewer a lot. But in general, in historically exclusionary jurisdictions especially, and this is more so in the Bay Area maybe than in Southern California, HCD seems at least somewhat willing to hold their feet to the fire. With cities, it's like, what is a historically exclusionary jurisdiction? Atherton, definitely, but in some places that maybe some of us might describe as exclusionary, HCD doesn't see it the same way. So it's really about making a strong argument to them and giving them all the information they need without condescension or too much politics. And then if you can show HCD that a city has received public input about a problem in its housing element, like a developer says that there's a constraint that makes it impossible to build, and then the city ignores it, HCD often takes that pretty seriously. But again, all of these things, sites, AFFH, public input process, it's all about getting programs. And HCD wants to see that you have told the city the programs that you want. Not just that you have pointed out problems, but that you have been a partner bringing solutions to the table. So it's really important to not just pick holes in housing elements. It's important to give HCD information they don't know and show that you are giving the city actual policy solutions to the problems they're facing. So I think I could probably talk about this HCD stuff a lot longer, but Anne and I have some stories about our personal experiences that I think can illustrate some of the local strategies you can use at every point in the chain that we've just laid out to you of advocacy. So I'm going to pass it back to Anne to talk about Los Altos.
Okay, yeah, with Los Altos, we just did a lot beforehand. We gave the city a lot of information early, and we were on top of the whole process. And every time they released something, we were on top of it. And so what really happened with we're lucky. We started, Los Altos Affordable Housing Alliance brainstormed programs well before the start of the process. And I was also kind of bugging the city council to start. I made tons of data so that we'd be on top of it. I had a spreadsheet on every commercial property in the city. I had data on every multifamily project entitled in the last 10 years. So I knew how long it took, and I knew what was happening with every single one of those. It wasn't that's because there weren't very many. One of us is one of the members of LAHA is a former affordable housing developer who just knows everything about affordable housing and just tons about really everything. So we were early with our ideas. We gave input early. We were working with the council. We went to the community. We went to the hearings. We sent so many letters in the process, but I think we had luck, and the luck was that our city manager was replaced in the middle of the process by a city manager from Southern California who had already been through a housing element cycle in the 6th cycle. And then we had a very poor planning director, director of community development, and he also was replaced by someone who was very competent and also had been through 2 housing element cycles in different jurisdictions in this cycle. I think it was one in San Diego and one in Los Angeles, but he really knew what HCD was going to buy and what they were not going to buy. And he was and is really feels very strongly that he does not want the city on the wrong side of the law. So I think we were lucky because, and we had a city council. We had been lucky to elect a city council. Not lucky, I actually personally walked 3 precincts, every single door. But we did elect a pro-housing city council. So we kind of had everything. We were lucky that we had everything going in our direction. And we know that our neighborhood, 4 of our neighboring jurisdictions, 4 of our neighbors are in trouble. 2 of them, Palo Alto and Cupertino, got sued, and the other 2, Mountain View and Los Altos Hills, have builders' remedies projects. So those are our direct neighbors, and we're the only one who looks like we're in good shape. But a lot of it was luck. And sometimes you're not lucky, as Jeremy is now going to tell us.
I'll give a more uplifting spin on my part of the story, which is that the housing element process is resulting in policies being on the table that were never even in part of the discussion 10 years ago, even in cities that haven't yet made good housing elements. Leveraging this process is a very powerful way to get policy changes that cities would never make on their own. No matter how, it's extremely frustrating and hard. And I just want to give you a brief overview of the story of Inclusive Lafayette, my introduction to housing policy. I got involved in Inclusive Lafayette and helped co-found it in June 2020. And I was brand new to housing policy, and everybody who joined Inclusive Lafayette in that community was also brand new to housing policy. And we had pretty quickly, from June 2020 to December 2020, there'd been some hot button issues that helped us build relationships with the council and with city staff and build some natural alliances with organizations around town. But when I say June 2020 to December 2020, we got into the housing element without really knowing what we were getting into. And Lafayette started its housing element more than 2 years before the due date. Again, December 2020 was when they started the update process, and the due date was January 2023. So Lafayette had a long time that they were working on it, and I had a long time to kind of rev up and figure out what was going on. The backs spread of crisscross.
Jeremy, I'm not sure if it would be better for you to take your video off. We cannot hear you now.
Housing. And the city came up with a brilliant and visionary plan to increase density in exactly the places where multifamily housing is already allowed, as well as on the BART lot and this little sliver here and this little sliver over here. It comes down, if you look at a map of Lafayette, to that little tiny red strip. Again, the place where there was already a lot of multifamily. Not a win, that's obvious. But the thing is, Lafayette, over the course of this 2-year process, had a lot of discussions and some really, really compelling NIMBY pushback that was hard for the council and city staff to overcome. And frankly, we did not get lucky with city staff. We had some city staffers who were good, and I think a city manager who wanted to do well, but we had a planning director who has different ideas about what it takes to get housing built and what kind of housing is good for a community. And so it was really hard for us to work with him on getting good policies. And even when the council wanted to vote on good policies, believe it or not, Lafayette had a housing, friendly-ish council. The city planning director wouldn't put good policy proposals forward, so they never even got a chance to vote on good things. But nonetheless, even though Lafayette having started so early, is now like just as far behind as most other cities because they spent so much time bickering on public process rather than like just choosing policies and moving things forward. We have gotten the city to commit to some real rezonings. It is not nearly enough, but in some parts of downtown, they're talking about increasing the density from 35 dwelling units per acre to 75. It is in a tiny sliver right next to the freeway. And I am 100% confident that HCD is going to reject this and make them rezone more. But this is a first step toward that goal. And it's the sort of thing that if you told me that Lafayette was going to double its density part of downtown just 5 years ago, I would have said, no way, the city will never go for that. But because of the housing element process and our advocacy and HCD's enforcement, the city has continued to implement new policies. We also, even though it's right next to the freeway, it's a start. We also got the city to dedicate a 2-acre parcel of a parking lot, a city-owned parking lot downtown, and change at the very last minute. This was at the meeting before they submitted their last draft of the housing element to HCD. We got the city to commit to entitling a project and approving it for development by the end of 2025 instead of 2029. And this is the change we got at the last meeting. Getting a plan to release an RFP and entitle a project at all was a fight that we won. The city had initially had a bunch of city-owned parking lots in the housing element, and it was saying a bunch of affordable housing was going to get built on these parking lots, even though it had no plan to develop any of them. And in fact, some of them had been in prior housing elements and had not been developed because the city didn't have a plan. And I kind of skipped over all of this, but I mean, we went from not knowing anything to working with our council and going through this really long public input process. And then the city submitted a first draft, and we went and we talked to HCD, and we gave HCD all the information they needed to do a really thorough review. And HCD sent the information back. And even though the city is resistant to making changes, all of that process led to these real policy wins. And that's just the start. Because like I said, HCD is going to make cities go through 3 to 5 rounds of review. And for historically exclusionary cities like Lafayette that are in their second round of review, they probably have 2 or 3 more rounds to go. So we have a lot more time to get a few more big policy wins like this and rack up like a set of meaningful housing policy changes. So Anne and I just threw in some nice Alfred Tool art because why not? Anne and I wanted to talk a little bit about just random cities. And I don't know, Anne, I had some anecdotes I wanted to share, but I'm curious if you have anything you want to jump on.
I'll let you go, and then if there are questions, I can see if people want to answer. We'll see if people want to ask questions.
Wonderful. So I have a somewhat uplifting narrative that I'll share, but it's also like a narrative. It's like a narrative of woe and joy at the same time. So my friend Kalisha Webster works at Housing Choices, which is an organization that serves people with disabilities in San Mateo County. And in San Mateo, Kalisha, who is the housing advocate at Housing Choices, engaged in the most good faith way that you can possibly imagine. She did all of the best practices Anne and I had described, and she was doing them like, before I was doing them. And so, for example, a year and a half ago, or maybe not a year and a half ago, but a year ago, a little over a year ago, Kalisha sent all of the cities of San Mateo a data set with really detailed information about people with disabilities to help them with their needs analyses, to help them with their affirmatively furthering fair housing analyses. Then Kalisha met with all of the cities, met with a bunch of city staff and some council members. Then she wrote a package of housing reform laws and like verbatim what she and her organization would want in the housing element to support people with disabilities, and sent that to all of the cities so that cities could copy and paste all of this information into their housing element. And a number of cities did, and they took all of the information she gave her, and they have some really good policies to help people with disabilities. But the fact is, even when Kalisha did every single thing right, in a lot of cities, she did not get lucky. There was a roadblock, whether it was a staffer who didn't care about housing, or a council member, or a public that managed to just resist really hard and prevent good policies being in place. And despite all this work, Felicia, in some cases, like the housing element, doesn't reflect any of the information she shared. And those cities are facing penalties. Those cities are not certified, and they have a lot of rounds of review for the most part before they're going to be certified. And so Felicia's work is not in vain. It's just laying the groundwork for strong, robust enforcement. So don't lose hope when cities don't always respond to you the way they want. The process is long, and in some ways it is designed to penalize cities, but it takes time and it takes perseverance. So, our goal is not to penalize cities, it's to get really good housing plans, but, cities will take a lot of encouragement to get there in some cases. So that's what we're here to do, and I'll wrap things up there. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was all amazing. I feel like in these presentations, there's always something to be learned. And actually, before we go to questions, Janine has about 3 slides she'd like to share just on the status of where all of the cities and the county within Santa Cruz stand.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Give me 1 minute to get to that. Okay, well, thank you, actually, Jeremy and Anne, for that wonderful not breeze through, it's actually a very deep dive through housing elements and approaching housing elements. My goal here is really just to provide a status. I'm Janine Roth, by the way, I'm one of the Santa Cruz leads. Is just to provide just a snapshot of where we are in the process. And let me just go ahead and get into it. It's very sobering to hear Jeremy talk about 3 to 5 cycles with HCD, the initial one being 90 days, because what we have been hearing from the different jurisdictions in Santa Cruz County, and just as a reminder for Santa Cruz County, there are 4 cities. There's Capitola, the city of Santa Cruz, Scotts Valley, and Watsonville. And then there's the unincorporated county. So there's 5 jurisdictions in Santa Cruz County. The city of Santa Cruz and Capitola are the most, have the most aggressive timeline. They're both looking to get the first draft for public review out by I think the beginning of April. Scotts Valley has some notion of spring, so TBD on what that means. Watsonville is looking at June or July, and Santa Cruz County, the unincorporated, is looking at July. So I think you can see that we have some sense that we'll be out of compliance at the end of the year for some of these jurisdictions. What we have now, Anne, thank you for talking about our Santa Cruz YIMBY priorities. We have put together some priorities, and I really appreciate also, Anne, that you were talking about how it should be tuned to each of the jurisdictions and what they, what their situation is related to housing. But we have a link, and I know Elizabeth put it also in the chat. And they are things that some of us are using and everyone can use for the discussions with the electeds and the planners, the staff. And what we've started to see from those jurisdictions is we've already seen an initial site map, and actually that is being presented to their city council tonight. So we've already been looking at the site map that was part of the agenda packet, and we'll be able to hear what the conversation is related to the site map later on. Scotts Valley is promising that they'll have their initial site map on April 5th. And we haven't actually seen anything yet from the city of Santa Cruz, from Watsonville, or from the unincorporated county. I will say that for the city of Santa Cruz and the unincorporated county, I know that they're counting a lot on things like the downtown expansion plan, and the Santa Cruz County has talked about their sustainability update, which included some recent rezoning. So just expect to see some of that pop up again. And then I just wanted to highlight the upcoming opportunities for folks to be involved or to actually check in with these jurisdictions. I mentioned Scotts Valley is planning to go over their site map on April 5th. The city of Santa Cruz is planning a joint session with the city council and the planning commission. That's kind of to be announced, but we should expect that after their draft. Capitola also is expecting a community workshop when their draft is public. Watsonville, I think, is the one that we're the fuzziest on in terms of timeline, unless someone has some more current information. They also expect to do a community workshop. And then Santa Cruz County is putting together a stakeholder and a community panels where they will be meeting weekly in April and then going into May. And then again, the spring is the Scotts Valley Community Workshop. So April will be very busy. And I think that is, oh, one more. For folks to get involved locally, just know that we have on our website the web pages for each of the jurisdictions, santacruzyimby.org/housing elements. And when you go to their individual web pages, you certainly can sign up for their update emails. They'll send information about their projects. But just also know that Santa Cruz YIMBY, we intend to send lots of emails and post on socials when there are upcoming workshops, meetings, and other opportunities to provide feedback on housing elements. And I really love also the advice to put things in writing and to send them to the jurisdictions. And so we'll be sharing those with members for echoing and reinforcement with the electeds. It was also mentioned that we have weekly check-in meetings. So become a watchdog with those of us who have already been diving into this, and write to hello@santacruzyimby.org for more information on how to get involved in that. And that is the end. So back to you, Elizabeth.
That was great. Thanks, Janine. So we have time for about 5-ish questions. And Rafa, I know you had your hand up. So do you want to take it away with that?
Sure. I guess I have kind of a two-parter, but I hope it's helpful. So I've been digging in a little bit to the city of Santa Cruz's housing element plans, met with city staff, looked a little bit at their 5th cycle site inventory. And what stood out to me in the 5th cycle was that the city included a lot of sites on non-vacant commercial properties, like the Safeway on the west side and the Staff of Life grocery store on the east side. And my question is, like, when we're looking at these sites in the site inventory, like it doesn't seem that those are particularly likely to get developed because there are like active commercial uses. But like, is taking off like a big site like that really that helpful when there isn't necessarily anything else that can be added? Like how do we think about like where the sites on the site inventory should go? And I'll caveat that by saying the city of Santa Cruz believes that it has adequate zone capacity, that it doesn't need to do any rezoning. They say that they have 170% of their zone capacity to meet their RHNA already. But they do admit that they need to double their current rate of housing production in order to meet their goals. So they're going to focus more on like the programs to do that, but they don't really have like specific, really good ideas about how to double production in any meaningful way without, and even though they're not even talking about doing any rezoning because they don't think they need to.
I can take that. I think that it's worthwhile hitting them. This is not a good plan, right? They're not changing enough they're not changing their trajectory. They're not building enough housing. They're not planning a rezoning, and that is not enough. So it's just not enough. And I think you can make a case to HCD that it's not enough, because it's up to them to explain why what they're doing is going to make a change, and it doesn't sound like they're actually making any changes. As to whether it's worthwhile to get these bad sites off the site inventory, I always think it is, if they really are bad, because no net loss comes into play. And then, so they have a certain number of sites, and it's smaller, they've gotten rid of some of their buffer. And then those sites get used up, not for the low income housing that they said they were going to be used for. And then they are required to rezone something else. No net loss requires them to have enough zone capacity. And so if you shrink their zone capacity, it makes it more likely that no net loss is going to happen. So I would definitely, if they're really bad sites, I say get them off the inventory. Do the best you can. Now, I don't know that the grocery stores necessarily are bad sites, but if they are, they should be gotten off.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are different types of sites in the inventory, right? So they're like publicly owned sites, which actually need a plan because the city can control them. And there are privately owned sites which a city can't control development of. And I always see the privately owned ones as like the inventory of putting privately owned sites on a list and saying they're going to become housing is purely like a tool to get policy change. So like the Safeway site might be good, it might be bad, but like there is probably a density and a set of zoning standards and approval processes where we'd shrug our shoulders and say like, well, this Safeway might not get redeveloped, but like maybe the sites around it that are also going to get rezoned would, or maybe like we're setting up this Safeway to get redeveloped in like, a few years in like a realistic timeline. Like the sites are a mechanism for policy change. It's all a mechanism for policy change. So if you see a way to say this site needs new policies to make it viable, then that's the case. And I would, rather than seeing sites as good or bad, see them as, are there policies in place to make them realistic for redevelopment? Because almost anything can have policies in place for redevelopment.
Right, but if you say so the unrealisticness here is not upzoning.
Yeah.
Right. And assuming that something that wasn't developed is suddenly going to be developed. And it's certainly very likely that it would be developed if you allowed a whole lot of housing there, because someone could make money and they would do it.
I think one of the issues for Santa Cruz is that like the Mullen densities, which for those who don't know, the state has sort of like these safe harbor densities for zoning that they say are adequate to meet affordable housing goals. Realistically, those aren't dense enough for projects to be feasible in the city of Santa Cruz. So they might be able to say on paper that yes, the Safeway on the west side has a zone capacity of 20 units an acre or whatever, meets the Mullen density, so it can count. But realistically, to actually develop it, it probably needs to be 3 times that.
5 times.
Yeah, so HCD lets the Mullen density say like, you can count units for lower income housing, but the Mullen density doesn't, as I understand it, provide like a greater presumption of redevelopment or something. It's just whether or not it can be used for lower income housing. So like you're making a case, the same kind of case, basically no matter what density they're at, is like, is something likely to be built in the planning period under that density? But it's like likely to be built, such an abstract concept. So it's like, there are things like, are there leases on the building? How long is the lease? Is it a successful business? Has it, you've mentioned it's been in the inventory before and hasn't redeveloped. Like these are all, they're not definitive pieces of evidence, but like together they make a case that is likely to mean something to HCD in terms of how they see that site.
Well, that's helpful, at least for myself, especially for the grocery stores too, the 2 that Rafa mentioned. They're very popular grocery stores in Santa Cruz, so always seem to bat an eye when something like that is in the site's inventory. I know in Berkeley, they had a problem with one of their also very popular grocery stores being on their site's inventory, which was then taken off after some community backlash. So I think we're just trying to avoid that to be the case here.
Well, the one thing you can do if you think that they're doing this in bad faith, is to try to use the NIMBYs to get those grocery stores off the site inventory and to be replaced by something that you can zone to an appropriate density. Because what you want is for things to be upzoned so they can be built. And if the NIMBYs hated the idea that their grocery stores are going to be taken away, fine, then come up with something else and zone it appropriately.
I like that idea of using NIMBYs for good. Janine, you have your hands up.
Yes, I wanted to ask about several of our cities have large R1 single family zoned areas and may not be doing any rezoning in those areas. And I think that the strategy that they're counting on are ADUs. And I wanted to just ask if you were seeing in the policies and programs, other cities that have high percentage of single family zoning, if you were seeing policies and programs that were being adopted to move past ADUs. And I mean, one of you mentioned SB 10. So are you actually seeing cities that are committing to review and adoption of SB 10 to be able to get higher density in the single family areas? Or what are you seeing?
I think Mountain View is doing it. I'm not an expert on that, but I think Mountain View is doing it. But these ADU, this do everything through ADUs. We have a lot of that contagion here, but it's not seeming to work. The cities that are trying to do that, and it's Woodside, Atherton, Hillsborough, and Monte Sereno, I don't think it's working for them. So they're going to have to do something else because that's not enough. And for those cities, SB 10 would be good, although it's also the case, as far as I can tell, that HCD, at least in the Bay Area, is not going to approve a housing element that doesn't have multifamily housing in it at the Mullen density.
The question, like, I mean, how many cities are actually moving forward with SB 10 rezonings right now? Not very many. There are some, but I don't think there is a single one in San Mateo County. You've got like Atherton, Woodside, Hillsborough, sort of like this string of wealthy, ultra wealthy suburbs that are like all single family. Some of them, I mean, really just Portola Valley, but they at different times have considered multifamily, but they've struggled to do like a good missing middle housing policy thing.
Well, we just anticipate some, we're concerned about the AFFH in a couple of these cities that have a large amount of single family zoning and don't seem to plan to upzone any areas.
Yeah, just say like have a little pep in your step because HCD doesn't seem to like that the ADU strategy very much. So
okay.
No, they're not. They don't seem to be buying it.
Good to know. Yeah, we met recently, so with some cities, so at least we'll know for next time. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? Thoughts, anything generally? Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, thank you both for coming and talking. This was very great. I'm looking forward to reading over the slides again. If we have any questions for you, are you both on the Slack or where are you? Where are you found, I guess? And are you willing to, answer our questions after this meeting as well?
yes, we are happy to answer meetings. We are on the Slack. Terminally on the Slack.
Terminally.
I relate to that.
Great. And I can also add your guys' emails in the chat in case anyone on here isn't on Slack, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Cool. And then we'll have Bennett and John.
So yeah, Janine kind of gave the status update on our different jurisdictions. So I would just say, what do you think, if you were in our position, what would you be doing right now? Reviewing perhaps like we don't have anything to look at yet for a proposal, but we want to be able to respond quickly when stuff comes out. So like read the last maybe read the last element to get familiar with the sites, or how would you recommend we get prepared right now?
Yeah. Read the last element, look at the last sites, and figure out where you think that the housing should be zoned for. Figure out what you think the program should be.
Like write the programs you want to see, and then give those to the city verbatim. If there's any preparation, it's like, the least abstraction possible and the most specificity is good. So, if you have sites and if you have policies, like I'd maybe talk to a developer at this point. That's something I wish I'd done much earlier on, and been like, what are the barriers that you're facing? Because I bet developers will say that Santa Cruz's approval process is onerous and difficult, but I bet they'll say that the zoning is an issue too sometimes, and that might be a helpful starting point.
Great, John.
Oh, and also, okay, but one other thing is like, start if you can, like, I mean, it sounds like you're meeting with city staff and council members, like, tell them what you're gonna do. Tell them that you are going to comment on a housing element, you are going to write HCD a letter, you are going to engage at every level of the process. Like, do not surprise people, it will piss them off. And you can disagree with them and do things that make them mad, but like they won't get mad at you if you just tell them you're gonna do it. I wish I had told my city that I planned to write to HCD. I told cities in San Mateo County that I was going to write to HCD, and some of them still didn't get it, and they're still confused and upset, but some of them were like, you told us what you were gonna do, that's all we ask. Like, you're telling on us to the state, but like, we knew it was gonna happen, and we were ready for that. So yeah, right now, like, you kind of have a plan. Tell the people who you need to convince to vote a certain way, and who you need to convince to like make certain proposals, what that plan is.
I would like to point out that NIMBY city councils in San Mateo County praise Jeremy. Not just, I've heard several of them say specifically praise him. So you should follow his advice.
Sound advice. And John?
Hey guys, so I can tell you Anne is amazing on the Slack. I've actually spoken to her a lot. I've followed basically all of your plans already. I've met with the city council. I've met with all our planning commissioners. I'm meeting with specific developers on sites that I want to get developed. And then I brought that to our community development director, as well as specific policies that I want, in particular, minimizing parking minimums on the affordable housing things that they're going to zone. I've actually seen our site inventory in Capitola. They wouldn't like give it to me to have, but I got a first look. And they did include some of my ideas. So all that definitely works. My question is, how do we go after city councilors in particular who say they're for affordable housing, but consistently vote against affordable housing? I've been able to do it using things like Instagram and like community pressure, and it's been very successful. But I would love if there's like a policy or more of a, like, are there ways to write letters that target the city councilors directly outside of using social pressures? Like, is there a way to identify them with the HCD, or to identify where you can see the bad faith efforts are being done? Just because I want a record of it, essentially, is what I want. I don't want it to just be like Instagram and, you know, me talking to people in the community. I want a record I can point to saying, like, I told these people this information, they had this information, and they still acted in bad faith. And in particular, I'm talking about city councilors, not city staff. I have been unable to find this anywhere. And I've talked to a lot of people on the Slack. So any ideas?
Are you looking, just to clarify, you're looking to have a record of like a city council member acting in bad faith, or
yeah, so kind of, I mean, that is something like that. Is there any way in general to target city councilors outside of the, so I was a political campaigner for years, so I know that aspect of it. I know how to use my community to target city councilors and put pressure on them, how to use the local Democratic Party to do that. That I can all do. I'm wondering if there's a way through organizations like the HCD or even, I don't understand any of that stuff. I'm terrible at policy. Even the policy ideas were like fed to me by people and then I brought them there. I can't figure out a way to get on the record that city councilors are, acting in bad faith, essentially, even when it's clear that they are. And I should be clear too, me and SCYIMBY sort of disagree on this strategy. This is me personally. This is not like I'm not speaking for them here. This is something I want to do. Mm-hmm. If there's a way to do it, I'm more than willing to do it, even if it's antagonistic, and antagonism doesn't really bother me. Like I've told them all the letters I'm going to write to the staff, but the staff is just staff. Like they're just doing their job. I want to pressure the city councilors in particular to act in good faith and to vote on affordable housing projects. My jurisdiction has built nothing for 2 cycles. Literally, we just got our first affordable housing project pushed to council in like 12 years, and it's not even on the docket yet. That's sort of what I'm dealing with. So we have a net loss, in fact, over the last decade and a half in housing.
Well, you want to take this, Jeremy, or want me to take it?
You're jumping into it. You can take the first crack, and I'll surely add something.
Okay. So HCD, I think, is not really concerned with why a city is doing what it's doing. Right? Whether they're terrible, bad faith people, or whether they're stupid, or why the city council does what it does. What they are concerned about is what it does. So suppose that a city council member does something that HCD just loves, and they do it in complete bad faith. HCD does not care. They care what you do, not why you did it. So if indeed your city, which is Capitola, right?
Correct.
Right. Capitola is in fact supposed to create affordable housing, and they're not. That is as far as HCD is concerned, that's the problem. That's the problem that needs to be addressed, not why they're doing it, that they're doing it. So you just need to document that they have the opportunity to do affordable housing. They are required to do it, and they aren't. And it doesn't matter why they did it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of hearing there's like 2 questions in what you're saying, John, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like question about making sure HCD knows about like what city council members do and what city councils do. And there's a practical, like, that's a relevant question because there are all sorts of programs and commitments cities make where they're like, we're going to study this, or we're going to, bring this for a public hearing. And if you can demonstrate that maybe not just one city council member, but like a city has a history of stonewalling or like dragging its feet on moving forward with a certain policy area, you can push HCD to be like, oh, well, you need to make a firmer commitment. I mean, there are all kinds of ways you can get cities to make a firmer commitment, but one way to get HCD really, I guess, ham-fisted about the cities making clear commitments is to demonstrate that they have waffled in the past. There's a second question about how to like.
How do you demonstrate that they've waffled?
Show the record. That's it's like it's either so history or it's not.
The lack of building the projects is the waffling.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's like you have to give specific examples of
right,
how
no,
that's played out.
So like the planning commission pushing it, and then voting it down and not sending it to council repeatedly.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we do, our planning commission tends to just never send anything to the council, so the council never has to vote on it. That's sort of that's our system.
Yeah,
and our planning commission is all appointees.
Evidence is the best evidence. Like just show what is happening, and that's what HCD wants to see.
With that in mind, we rezone the same commercial area every arena cycle. We just add more to literally the same stretch of commercial area. We don't rezone any other part of the city whatsoever. We start with it and then we cut it off of the thing. Would that be evidence of not doing it correctly?
I'm like, I'd like, it's evidence, but like your goal isn't to prove good faith or bad faith. It's like, is it going to lead to housing and accomplish AFFH goals? So like,
Right.
I think your
So it's
argument
not, 'cause
is
it hasn't.
it's like, they're doing this, it hasn't led to, yeah, exactly. They're doing this and
It's
hasn't
like a
led to housing,
circle.
and it's a fair housing violation. Like it's just one place where they're saying the housing's going to get built. Like, yeah, exactly.
So they keep rezoning the same sites. I've been told that if they rezone a site more than twice, there's like a mechanism to stop, to like complain about that. What is that mechanism?
Not really a mechanism to complain. It's like a special rule that they have to allow by right, housing by right on those parcels if it's 20% affordable. So it's like, if you want to keep including a site in the housing element after 2 cycles, then you have to do a special kind of rezone to justify that. It's a pretty, I mean, it's like a inadequate policy prescription. Like, a site hasn't been developed for 2 cycles, so you make development by right for 20% affordable. Like, it's an incentive, but that's not like going to make the site developable on its own.
I'm
Do
sorry.
they already have to do that? Or sorry, this will be my last question. Do they already have to do that, or do I have to tell them they have to do that? Because
No, I mean, they have to do it. It's prescribed.
All right. Thank you,
Yeah.
guys. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for answering all of those questions. And again, everything. I'm sure you all dealt with it in the Bay Area and without this amazing guidance, but just a lot of policy changes and new legislation for this cycle. So we're all really trying to wrap our minds around it, but this is really such a great help. And I'm sure we all will be bothering the both of you to some extent as we move forward. But thank you on behalf of all of us, and have a great rest of your night.
Yeah,
Thank you.
good to see you all.
Thank
Can we
you.
like,
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
again.
Thank you so much. Thank
can we
you.
stay for a post-event debrief?
That'd be good.
Okay, sweet.